B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, June 4th, 2020. The guy they called Mad Dog has turned around and bitten his former master. And not just on the leg. Mad Dog Mattis quit as defense secretary. Trump says he fired him, but the fact is that Mattis quit first. And the reason he quit was because Trump was threatening to pull all U.S. troops out of Syria. And that's one of the few things that I have agreed with Donald Trump on over the past few years. So I hold no big love for Jim Mattis. The fact that he chose to serve in the Trump administration to begin with, along with several other former military brass, takes him down a notch to begin with. And the bloodthirsty way that he managed his assignments, particularly in Iraq, makes me no fan of Jim Mattis. But he took to the Atlantic and decided to unload on Trump. And since he left the White House last year, even on a book tour, he has declined to speak ill of his former commander-in-chief. So it is therefore remarkable. And when we look at the people who now come out of the shadows to agree with Mad Dog Mattis, this is a significant development. So Mattis wrote, Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who doesn't try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. Now, those are tough blows coming from a retired general. And he also criticized his successor, Mark Esper, the former Raytheon executive, who is now on thin ice because he decided to publicly disagree with Trump about the need to deploy American forces in the United States to patrol the streets. Now, Esper has been back and forth on the conference call with governors where Trump was telling them to dominate. He referred to the protest streets of America as a battle space. But then he said he didn't want to deploy troops under the Insurrection Act. And yesterday, he agreed with the decision to send a couple of hundred troops that had been put on standby in the Beltway area back to their base. Then he went to the White House in the afternoon where Trump, who only knows angry, apparently chewed him out big time. And then he sent his new blonde press secretary, McEnany, out to declare that he is still the Secretary of Defense for now. So that's the way that Trump bullies the people who attempt to serve him, even when they try to kiss his ass. So back to Mattis. He said, when I joined the military 50 years ago, I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Never did I dream that troops taking the same oath would be ordered under any circumstance to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens, much less to provide a bizarre photo op for the elected commander-in-chief with military leadership standing alongside. So that is a slap at General Milley, the current chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who showed up in camo fashions and then patrolled the streets of Washington after being designated as in charge by Trump. Now, we don't know what that means because there's no legal basis that has been laid before us to declare what his status is. So Trump, of course, can't take this kind of criticism. And he went to his dear Twitter and he slammed General Mattis by saying that one of the few things that he and Obama had agreed on was firing Jim Mattis. Now, Mattis had been fired from the upper ranks of the Pentagon back in 2013 because he was viewed as too much of a hawk on Iran policy. At the time, they were negotiating the six-nation deal on nuclear issues with Iran. That's probably one of the reasons that Trump was attracted to him as a Secretary of Defense, because starting a war with Iran has always appeared to be at the top of Trump's agenda, and I believe that that is stimulated by his staunch support for Israel and the symbiotic relationship of power that he sometimes shares with Benjamin Netanyahu. So John Kelly, who was the former chief of staff, he was the second or the third, right? It's Priebus. Yeah, then it was Kelly. It's hard to keep track. He chimed in. And first, he corrected or contradicted the president's tweet regarding firing Jim Mattis. Quote, "The president did not fire him. He didn't ask for his resignation. The president has clearly forgotten how it actually happened or is confused. The president tweeted a very positive tweet about Jim until he started to see on Fox their interpretation of his resignation letter. Then he got nasty. Jim Mattis is an honorable man," says General Kelly. So this then leads to Lisa Murkowski, the timid senator from Alaska, who has occasionally voted against the Republican Party line, but otherwise is a pretty, she's forced into a position of loyalty. And it seems that she is beginning to squirm. So she said that she agreed with Mattis and that, quote, "I was really thankful. I thought General Mattis's words were true and honest and necessary and overdue." Then she added that when she saw the statement released, "I felt like perhaps we're getting to the point where we can be more honest with the concerns that we might hold internally and have the courage of our own convictions to speak up." Now she's speaking for herself and presumably other what would pass for moderate Republicans in today's continuum. And she's also trying to talk to herself, saying, "Come on, Lisa, don't be afraid of this bully just because he's going to tweet you to death. You, after all, survived a primary challenge and won as an independent, if I recall correctly, a write-in candidate to get the term in the Senate that you have today." Asked whether she could still support Trump in the coming election, Murkowski said, "I'm struggling with it. I have struggled with it for a long time." So why is this such a struggle? The political calculus that you have to embrace in order to struggle with supporting Trump. And I have long argued that until these Republican senators are personally threatened with losing their seats, they will continue to submit to the domination of their dear tweeter leader. And she is Exhibit A for that today. So a little more here on Mark Esper and the back and forth. So he had said that using U.S. troops on U.S. soil should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. So here it is, Kayleigh McEnany, the new White House press secretary. She's just another blonde 10 to Trump, but she is effective. She lies more skillfully than Sarah Huckabee Sanders was able to do. Oh, and we'll get to the first boy, Sean Spicy Spicer, here in just a minute. He's back. So the president was angered by Esper's remarks and excoriated him later at the White House. Asked on Wednesday night whether Trump still had confidence in Esper, Kayleigh McEnany said, "As of right now, Secretary Esper is still Secretary Esper, but that should the president lose faith, we will all learn about that in the future." So he loves to keep people. I mean, Esper is one of the handful of people who's actually confirmed to his cabinet post. Trump loves to have acting officials because they're even more scaredy cat and willing to dance to the tune that he calls at any moment. So General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he's now dancing around things a little bit too. He released a message to top military commanders affirming that every member of the armed forces swears an oath to defend the Constitution, which he said gives Americans the right to freedom of speech and peaceful assembly. And Esper is claiming he really didn't know that they were going over to St. John's Church for the Hold the Bible photo op. Then he said, well, I kind of knew that. I mean, he's just, he's afraid. And so he says whatever is expedient at that moment. And well, here it is. Esper said that he was unaware of his destination when he set out with the president on the stroll to what he thought was a visit to view troops near Lafayette Square. I didn't know where I was going. I mean, to have an adult who is the civilian in charge of the world's biggest military say, I didn't know where I was going. Well, why don't you ask Siri, dude? Oh, White House officials were furious, says the New York Times, and Esper tried to walk back his comments. He acknowledged he did know that he was going with Trump to St. John's Church, and he said that it took nearly 24 hours for authorities to determine that a flight of helicopters that buzzed Washington, D.C. in a threatening manner that is used by the U.S. to intimidate civilians in war zones. He said, well, those belong to the District of Columbia National Guard. And one of them was marked with medic indications. You know, it had the Red Cross on the side. And it was being used for offensive military flyovers. They were buzzing the ground, you know, making all the trees shake and people's hair going sideways. So this is just such a strange scene as Trump humiliates the same people that he empowers to carry out his orders. I've never seen anything like it. So Barack Obama spoke up yesterday, and while he took pains not to directly confront the current resident of the White House, he offered an interesting mix of hope and change. And he described the current situation as an opportunity. He said that he was strikingly more upbeat. For those of you who have been talking about protest, just remember that this country was founded on protest. It's called the American Revolution, Obama said. Every step of progress in this country, every expansion of freedom, every expression of our deepest ideals have been won through efforts that made the status quo uncomfortable. And we should all be thankful for folks who are willing in a peaceful, disciplined way to be out there making a difference. So he called on every mayor in the United States to review use of force policies, aggressively pursue an 8-point slate of police reforms, including mandatory de-escalation of conflicts, a ban on shooting at moving vehicles, timely reporting of violent incidents, and prohibitions on some forms of restraint used by the police. Quote, chokeholds and strangleholds, that's not what we do. Well, Mr. Former President, it is what we do. And I am glad to hear you calling it out as something we shouldn't be doing. But Obama is infected with his own exposure to the status quo. And the painful way that he responded to Michael Brown's shooting in Ferguson, many of the other peaceful protests, including Keystone XL, and, of course, the Occupy movement. And so when he talks about change, he's talking about it in incremental manners. And this is a period where that won't fly. And he went out of his way to say that the vast majority of police officers, in his view, were not violent, predicted many would ultimately support reforms despite the opposition of their unions. That's just a variation of the bad apples argument. And I've heard that till I want to choke on applesauce just in the past week. All these people get trotted out on cable TV who are, former FBI, former police, this or that. Well, they're just a few bad apples. Well, no. If that were the case, those bad apples would be turned in by the good apples. And that is the fundamental problem that we have in law enforcement today. That the good cops, and there are some, I'm not going to, paint them all with the same brush. But their complicity in the code blue silence is the biggest cultural change that we need to achieve. And I don't see it on the horizon right now. So here's a description from the New York Times coverage. Obama, as he often does, tried to avoid a one-on-one battle with his successor, a fight he thinks will energize the president's conservative base and overshadow his friend Joe Biden, who he thrust into the position of the presumptive nominee. That's my view, as you know. So Stacey Abrams kind of extended the Obama theme in an op-ed published today in the New York Times, and the headline reads, "Stacey Abrams, I know voting feels inadequate right now." And in a long preamble, she describes how we have a very serious situation, that when she ran for governor of Georgia, that she encountered many people who don't believe their vote counts, and that her key message is that she almost got elected. She got 1.9 million votes in Georgia, the highest number of Democratic votes in Georgia history. And she describes that as a victory. And I'm sorry, Ms. Abrams. I realize that you were cheated out of a victory, but you're not the governor, and so you can't claim it as a victory. And then she undermines her own case. I am not calling for violent revolt here. We've done that twice in our nation's history to claim our freedom from tyranny, and when we fought a civil war, to recognize at least a little the humanity of blacks held in bondage. Now, I don't want any elected official to advocate for violent revolt, but this kind of a statement aligns her with the establishment, with a militarized police response, and I'm sorry that she felt compelled to state it that way. A little bit later in her article, she says, as the first black woman ever to win a primary for governor for a major political party in American history, burnishing her credentials, one who ran against one of the worst purveyors of voter suppression and xenophobia since George Wallace, I watched in real time as the conflicts in our evolving nation became fodder for racist commercials, horrific suppression, and the largest turnout of voters of color in Georgia's history. Despite the final tally of the election, our campaign energized a new American majority in tremendous ways, proving the resilience and possible destiny of our nation. Every night of the past week, we've witnessed the anguish and anger of demonstrators, their cries punctured by politicians urging them to vote their power. Both are right. Protest to demand attention to the wrenching pain of systemic injustice. Vote because we deserve leaders who see us, who hear us, who are actually willing to act on our demands. Voting will not save us from harm, but silence will surely damn us all. And I've been asking myself, where's Bernie? And I looked it up. Bernie did issue a statement in the middle of last week, which I missed. And then today, I saw a post on Twitter, and in 2.5 minutes in this video, I think that he makes a much stronger case than either Obama or Stacey Abrams.
As I think everybody understands, this is just an unbelievable moment in American history. As I speak, there are tens and tens of thousands of people coast to coast marching for racial justice, marching in horrified opposition to the police murder of George Floyd, understanding that we need real police department reform where police officers are held accountable for their actions and when found guilty are punished to the full extent of the law. People increasingly understand that we need real criminal justice reform so that we don't end up with more people in jail disproportionately, African American, Latino, Native American, than any other country on earth. But it's not just police department reform. It's not just criminal justice reform. As we speak right now, as a result of the pandemic and the economic collapse, some 20% of our people are unemployed. And we need a federal jobs program which puts people back to work. And God knows there's more than enough work to be done. Rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure, transforming our energy system, dealing with childcare, dealing with education, dealing with healthcare. That right now in America, when people are losing their jobs, they're also losing their health insurance by the millions. So we have to continue the fight for a Medicare for all single-payer program. So right now, in this unprecedented moment in American history, when we have a president who is moving us in a more and more authoritarian direction, when we have a president who doesn't understand the Constitution, doesn't care for the Constitution, wants to disrupt through the military peaceful demonstrations. Now is the time that we stand together and make sure that Congress does the right thing.
So I think Bernie really nails it. And he ties together not just the injustice dealt to George Floyd and many people before and unfortunately probably people after him, but he ties it together to the deep-seated anguish that unemployed Americans, dispossessed, those who have lost their work, have not received an unemployment check even though they deserved one. And he ties it to his signature issue of single-payer health care. And I just wish Bernie were still running. It is so disappointing to see the way he ducked out so early. And he did pick up delegates in the primaries that were held this week on Tuesday. But by stepping aside, he has denied many Americans an important voice, even if he had not prevailed in the race for delegates for the Democratic nomination. And I've been holding this for a couple of days, but I want to recommend to you a blog post that I found by Russell Dobular. First time I've heard of him. And he writes, the headline is, "Democracy is Broken, Why 51% of Sanders supporters are Considering a Third Party." A new Emerson poll has found that 51% of Sanders supporters are considering casting their vote for an independent or third-party candidate in November. And he offers, I think, great context here. He said, "Nothing could emblemize how few fucks the power brokers in the Democratic Party have to give about actually persuading voters than their alignment with a cognitively impaired candidate with the kind of record that's bound to turn off huge swaths of their base. Trump won the Midwest largely by attacking NAFTA and other trade deals that have proved to be a disaster for the working class. So why would you line up behind one of the people most associated with pushing those policies in Washington?" And he makes many other great arguments. Let me pull a quote here. The mostly younger voters who are taking a hard look at Howie Hawkins in the Green Party and Jesse Ventura have rejected the whole premise because they were never given any reason to accept it in the first place. War, surveillance, a gig economy, climate catastrophe, spiraling inequality, and now a global pandemic is all they've ever known. And this was written on the 5th of May. I only discovered it online last week, so this predates the George Floyd incident and all that has followed from it. So I'll include a link in the show file for this podcast so you can find it, and I encourage you to give it a read. At the New York Times today, their Supreme Court watcher Linda Greenhouse reviews last Friday night's late-night decision that blocked the effort by a Christian group to force California to allow it to open its church without restrictions this past Sunday. And Greenhouse notes that the 5-4 decision gives her considerable dread because of the way Brett Kavanaugh, who could have just voted no and made no statement, that's the way these processes work, he instead chose to issue a published dissent. And he made, unconvincing and irrational arguments, comparing a church to a cannabis dispensary, which was allowed to open, but the church was given restrictions of either 25% of the fire marshal's official population, in a given space, or 100 people, whichever is lower. So the argument was made that this was an urgent issue, and Kavanaugh picked this up in his opinion. The church would suffer irreparable harm from not being able to hold services on Pentecost Sunday. That was this past Sunday. So it was so urgent that those people be able to worship. And Greenhouse, who I believe is Jewish, but I don't know, she writes, I'm baffled why a particular liturgical observance would have even a walk-on role in this opinion. Last weekend was also Shavuot, a major Jewish holiday. But it's the Christian calendar about which recently appointed federal judges seem exclusively concerned. And she notes that John Roberts, the Chief Justice, wrote a kind of a vanilla opinion, but just was, here it is. Roberts must have concluded that the Kavanaugh dissent couldn't go unrebutted, writing just for himself in 5 paragraphs devoid of rhetoric and labeled concurring in denial of application for injunctive relief. He offered a sober explanation of the obvious. He noted that similar or more severe restrictions apply to comparable secular gatherings, including lectures, concerts, movie showings, spectator sports, theatrical performances, where large groups of people are there together for extended periods of time. He said the California rule exempts or treats more leniently only dissimilar activities, such as operating grocery stores, banks, and laundromats, in which people neither congregate in large groups nor remain in close proximity for extended periods. And Greenhouse's alarm, I think, is underscored by Trump's photo op. We'll get to that deeper in the stack here, but the way evangelicals think of that as standing with Jesus. And the way he panders to the evangelical sects in this country is it's just astounding. And it sets the stage for posers as, becoming religious demagogues in the future. I want to recommend Caitlin Johnstone, the Australian pundit who really understands life in America. And she writes about the twin views of the United States. The one that says that we are the greatest, the shining city on a hill. She calls that the bedtime story. And then she calls the other version, the reality version, a waking up story. And she said if you've heard the waking up story, you would expect no such thing of the bedtime story. You would understand that racial disparities never left the nation in question, and that the establishment, which still keeps J. Edgar Hoover's name on the FBI building, has no intention of doing anything about the police force's role in it. You would understand that the role of the police is not to protect and serve the people, but to protect and serve the empire, in the exact same way that is the role of the military. You would understand the empire is no more likely to voluntarily dispense with the violent tactics of its increasingly militarized police force than it is to dispense with its air force or nuclear warheads. And then I've also linked to Chris Hedges. His latest commentary is really insightful and powerful. And before I quote a couple of comments from it, I want to note that it's posted at the Scheer Post, and that's spelled S-C-H-E-E-R. That's Robert Scheer, a guy I've known for a long time, have deep respect for, and he was the co-founder of TruthDig and had a falling out with his editor who kind of shut it. Well, she did. She shut it down, and so he has rebuilt his web network at sheerpost.com. Be sure to bookmark that if you weren't aware of its recent emergence. So, Chris Hedges. The ruling elites no longer have legitimacy. They have destroyed our capitalist democracy, replaced it with a mafia state. The loss of control over our system of rulership, the misuse of all democratic institutions, the electoral process and laws to funnel money upwards into a handful of oligarchs, while stripping us of power, ominously means that the ruling elites can no longer claim the right to have a monopoly on violence. Violence employed by police and security agencies like the FBI, which have devolved into occupying forces to protect the exclusive interests of a tiny ruling criminal class, exposes the fiction of the rule of law and the treason of the ruling elites. He says there are three options: reform, which is impossible, revolution, or tyranny. And later he writes, the uprisings in the streets of American cities are not only about the wanton murder by police of yet another person of color, but a frantic fight to wrest back power over our own lives. They go far behind police brutality, a daily reality for those trapped in our internal colonies, where 1,100 citizens are murdered by police every year, almost all unarmed. Half the country lives in poverty, or a category called near poverty. The working class and the working poor are priced out of the healthcare system, and it leaves the message that the oligarchs are sending: they and their children are expendable. Then he goes off on Joe Biden, who was also at the forefront of the resegregation of our public school system, has repeatedly called for cuts to Social Security. He was instrumental in the disastrous trade deals such as NAFTA. Watching Stacey Abrams, he says, who certainly knows better, twist herself into contortions to lavish praise on Biden, even tossing the Me Too movement overboard, is another sad example of the corrosive disease of careerism. So he really, I think, lowers the boom on so much of the progressive movement in the Democratic Party and the way it has been so deeply compromised. Let's get his last paragraph here. The longer the ruling elites refuse to address the root causes behind these protests, the more they loot the treasury to enrich themselves and their fellow oligarchs, the more they engage in futile and absurd efforts to deflect blame, the more unrest will spread. The last desperate resort by the oligarchs to save themselves will be to stoke the fires of racialized violence between disenfranchised whites and disenfranchised people of color. This, I fear, is the next chapter in this saga. I saw this tactic used to deadly effect in the former Yugoslavia. These are dark times. They are about to get darker. Now, I really value Chris Hedges' voice, and I want to acknowledge that he has been writing and commenting in this vein for several years now. Chris Hedges has been deadly accurate. There is a movement to cut police department budgets, and this is something I fully support. Now, part of this is due to the reduced tax revenues that local governments are anticipating because of the COVID-19 shutdown and the lack of bailout money, at least not on the horizon, coming from Washington. So in Los Angeles, with a police budget of $1.8 billion, up until now, Mayor Eric Garcetti has been pushing for raises and bonuses and an overall 7% increase in the budget. But on Wednesday, he said he is now looking to make cuts even in the range of $150 million. Now, that is a huge turnaround. In New York, Bill de Blasio, who's we'll get to his defense of the indefensible behavior of his police department next. Anyway, he wants to leave the $6 billion budget intact while slashing education and youth programs and cutting other agencies by 80%. Well, that's not a cut, but it's included in this article at The Guardian. And there's also an increase proposed in Philadelphia. But there are now elected leaders who are emboldened and empowered to argue for dramatic cuts to police budgets. So Bill de Blasio and his often testy governor, they squabble a lot, and I blame Cuomo more than I do de Blasio. Cuomo is so condescending and often acts like Trump. Let me put a finer point out on that. Trump treats Cuomo in a dismissive way, and Cuomo, big brother, transfers that to Bill de Blasio. And he exerts his authority, saying, you can't decide whether your schools are open, and the state controls the subways, so, just stay out of that. And he's often undermining the efforts of Bill de Blasio. But in this case, they're on the same page. Cuomo supports the police. When asked about the police using batons to disperse peaceful protesters, he said that's not a fact. Well, in the same news summary on events in New York City over the last 24 hours, the New York Times reports, for example, at Cadman Plaza, a single line of riot police confronted the crowd, numbering in the hundreds. The protesters stood peacefully, their hands up, chanting for justice. Now, they were in violation of the curfew. I will acknowledge that. Behind them, police cars swarmed in. Hundreds of officers in riot gear poured into the plaza. By the time organizers tried to turn the protesters around to leave, they were surrounded. At around 9 p.m., officers holding shields and batons moved in from all sides. A standoff quickly devolved into chaos as officers began to push the crowd backward out of the plaza and into another line of police. Swinging their batons, they struck one woman on the knee. A young man's head bled profusely after he was hit. His hand shook as he reached for the back of his skull and saw how bloody it was. The protesters screamed that people were bleeding and needed help, but the officers did not acknowledge them and swinging their batons again. This is what de Blasio and Cuomo flatly deny. And I am a strong union supporter. I am still a member of SAG-AFTRA 40 plus years and counting. But I deplore the outsized impact and influence that police have. And sure, to get a good contract, I support collective bargaining. But when they interfere in policy, and the prison guards union here in California used to have the same outsized power, it's not the case anymore. But this is an abuse of collective bargaining, and police unions are one factor that strongly need to be addressed. We're now learning about a black man who said, "I can't breathe," before dying in police custody in March in Tacoma, Washington, was killed as a result of oxygen deprivation and physical restraint that was used on him. So an autopsy is calling this homicide. Now, the account of police, which we have to consider but not take as fact, is that the man in question here, whose name is Manuel Ellis, aged 33, that he was resisting arrest. And he was living in a drug safe house, recovering from addiction. So they can paint a picture of him as a bad guy. But his friends say he was living in a clean and sober house, getting his life together, uplifting. He was always on the up and up and taking care of people. So we need to know much more about this incident. But it does show that Minneapolis is not the exception, not the only place with those bad apples. Here in the Bay Area, the city of Vallejo has been a troubled scene between cops and the population, which is quite diverse, for a long time. There have been a number of flare-ups over police shootings of unarmed individuals over the years. And the latest episode occurred when an officer opened fire, shooting through his own windshield, at a 22-year-old man who was described as kneeling with his hands up at the scene of a Walgreens pharmacy that had been looted. Now, the cop, who fired 5 times and managed to hit the victim once, killing him, says that he thought he had a gun. And in this case, they are telling us that the young man, Sean Monterosa, had a 15-inch hammer tucked into the pocket of his sweatshirt. So based on the history in Vallejo, the police delayed this incident for almost 30 hours. They called in some National Guard reinforcements to fortify the police station, which was the scene of an angry protest by locals. And tonight could be a tense night in Vallejo. Now, yesterday, I shared with you an article from BuzzFeed which debunked 10 separate incidents across the country where we have seen videos that were posted on Twitter or Facebook or elsewhere showing neatly stacked bricks, often on pallets, in scenes that we were told were close to the path of protesters. And this was seen as kind of pre-placed ammunition. And depending on what your bias is, you might believe that the police put it there or left it there in order to incite violence, to enable people to get violent, and then they could violently crack down. And the White House used some of the same video footage yesterday to try to demonstrate that Antifa has been pre-placing rocks and bricks for their murky members to use to incite violence among peaceful protests. So over at The Intercept, I want to give credit to Robert Mackey, who took the very same videos that we were describing yesterday and debunked them, and the White House kind of sheepishly took down the video and just quietly withdrew it. The first clip, recorded in Dallas on Saturday night, shows a young black protester looking at the camera, sharing the conspiratorial idea that a pallet of bricks outside a courthouse must have been planted there to provoke a riot. This is a setup, the young man says to camera, and then says, "You got to do better." And so this is an example of how the same video footage can be used to persuade, or if you will, mislead people of very different polar political worldviews and biases. And I want to underscore that I have my own questions about where the violent protests originated. Who are those provocateurs? Black Bloc, Boogaloo Boys, Proud Boys, Antifa. Those are the widely named suspects, but it also could be undercover law enforcement because we know this has happened in the past. And so I got a note from one of our very loyal listeners, Paul Leto, and I want to read parts of it to you. He says, when an individual is accused of a crime or wrongdoing, asking the defendant what they were doing and believing it if they offer an innocent-sounding explanation is not only a basic reporting error, it is generally considered laughable. But when police stand accused of a crime or wrongdoing like damaging their own vehicles or planting bricks, you quoted some innocent-sounding explanations responding to this accusation by police themselves, and you accepted that without any noticeable laughter. Now, Paul, the only case where I cited the police was here in San Francisco. All of the other claims debunking the pallets of bricks placed in advance narratives came from other sources, from pictures on Google, from public photos, from proof that there was a construction site involved, and the case in suburban Los Angeles where the Chabad Jewish community was rebuilding a driveway with bricks. And so I just want to correct you, or at least your impression, that all of the arguments in the debunking came from police. Then he says, part of what you reported about bricks took the following form that I believe to be fallacious and too common in the media. The authorities are accused of something, and the so-called fact check of that claim is to ask the authorities if it is true and simply accept their explanation. Only if a host of other circumstantial evidence from independent sources corroborates that explanation should such self-serving explanations be allowed to end the story. In short, he concludes, some but not all of the claims against police regarding bricks have enough corroboration to be considered debunked. And I believe I allowed for that possibility both in my comments right now and in what I said yesterday. And I am looking for evidence of who the outsiders may be. We know that there's a whole pattern across the country of people who saw looting on television and said, hey, I'm going to get some of that going myself. And I don't support the looting. I understand that this kind of appropriation seems rational to certain people who feel deeply aggrieved and victimized by the capitalist system and the oligarchy, as Chris Hedges was arguing. But I also think it's just really stupid to imagine that the surveillance cameras aren't on when you go into that Vans shop and steal skate shoes, or when you go into a Nike retailer. Now, let me tell you a quick story. I was in Seattle, 1999, the WTO protest. It was all very peaceful until the night Bill Clinton was supposed to come to town to give a speech to this organization. And I saw the Seattle police in full riot gear line up in a cordon to protect, I think it was the Hilton Hotel, where all the people were staying, and that's where I think Clinton was supposed to stay that night. And just a block away was one of the official Nike retail shops. And above the door, there were silver letters. They're probably just brushed aluminum, but they spelled out Nike. And in the full view of 100 cops lined up to block the street, these three, what do you want to call them? Hooligans, anarchists, black bloc, or just opportunists. They climbed up on this little ledge where the letters were perched. They ripped them off. And they took the N, the I, the K, and the E and went across the street to a Starbucks and used them to break all of the windows and doors in the Starbucks. And not a single officer moved to stop them, to intercept them, or to arrest them. And so I fault the cops for allowing themselves to get so caught up in the head-bashing opportunities of a protest, peaceful or not, that they don't deploy people to stop looting when it's being broadcast live on TV. And I'm sure there are plenty of 911 calls coming in, hey, my shop is being looted, can you send a patrol car? And so this utter failure of law enforcement, I cannot take to be accidental or just because they were overwhelmed. They said, let that shit happen because it's going to make us look good when we track those kids down and haul them into court because they stole an armload of athletic shoes. I've also mentioned in the last few days suspicions that Boogaloo boys have been behind some of the violence that's broken out, especially at nighttime. And we have a case here of 3 alleged members of the Boogaloo movement who have been picked up in Las Vegas. They were planning to spark violence during protests, including a plan to use Molotov cocktails to hijack peaceful gatherings. Now, I have to be fair to these guys. I have no sympathy for the Boogaloos and the kinds of arguments that they have advanced. But this case, like so many, is tainted by the presence of a paid police informant. In this case, we don't know if it's the FBI, but credit is given to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And when they insert a paid informant or provocateur, those are typically people on the payroll of the FBI, and there's some 15,000 of them. On the streets of the United States today, they were mostly focused on busting American Muslims for crimes that they had never considered, using means that they could only get from their FBI informant. But we have in custody Stephen Parshall, age 35, Andrew Lynham, age 23 and an Army reservist, and William Loomis, aged 40. The alleged plan was thwarted by the Las Vegas Joint Terrorism Task Force. So I can report it to you, but I cannot extend any credibility to that particular case. And I haven't seen any other evidence brought forward or arrests made for any agitators from the outside of any stripe. And the arrests so far in most areas show that the people are coming from within a 50-mile radius. It's not like there is this huge traffic on the interstates of people bombing along to say, well, I got to get to the next scene of protest so I can find some pre-placed bricks and pull out my gun and, turn it into a violent incident. Every day I like to mention that we have the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund available for people who could use a $100 grant at these difficult times. I don't have a grant request today, but if you email Peter at peterbcollins.com and tell me why you could use $100, I'll bet you'll find that it will be granted. So it's interesting, the New York Times published an op-ed by right-wing knuckle-dragger Arkansas Republican Senator Tom Cotton. And the headline is, Tom Cotton, send in the troops. And Cotton, who likes to brag about his military experience in Iraq, he's a very hardliner. I read his op-ed, and, I don't agree with him, but it was not as incendiary as a Trump tweet, for example. And it is a point of view that the New York Times has the right to publish. And in some cases, as they point out, they almost have an obligation because it is opposite to the point of view of the editorial page of the paper. But there's big blowback from the staff at the New York Times. One of them tweeted, "Running this puts black New York Times staffers in danger." And another said, several Times staff members viewed Cotton's essay as an ominous call for military force against Americans, as African-American columnist Jamel Bowie put it. And here's another Pulitzer Prize winner, Nicole Hannah-Jones, an African-American. "I'll probably get in trouble for this, but to not say something would be immoral. As a black woman, as a journalist, as an American, I am deeply ashamed that we ran this." And the blowback that Mark Zuckerberg is receiving continues at Facebook, this time an open letter from founding employees of various descriptions who say that his position, giving a pass to Donald Trump's shooting and looting Facebook post, and it was a tweet too last week, is a betrayal of Facebook's ideals, and they urge him to reconsider. They write, "As early employees, we authored the original community standards, contributed code to products that gave voice to people and public figures, and helped to create a company culture around connection and freedom of expression. The Facebook we joined designed products to empower people and policies to protect them. The goal was to allow as much expression as possible unless it would explicitly do harm. Now it seems that commitment has changed. We no longer work at Facebook, but we do not disclaim it. We also no longer recognize it. We remain proud of what we built, grateful for the opportunity, and hopeful for the positive force it can become. We have a responsibility to speak up," they say. Today, Facebook's leadership interprets freedom of expression to mean that they should do nothing, or very nearly nothing, to interfere in political discourse. They've decided that elected officials should be held to a lower standard than those they govern. One set of rules for you and another for any politician, from your local mayor to the President of the United States. Zuck, so far, has not caved. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis. Worldwide, we have 386,000 COVID-related deaths, and in the United States, that number is now at 107,235. There are significant reports of increased positive testing in Texas, Arizona, and Oregon. Arizona reported the most significant spike, with more than twice as many cases identified last week compared to the week prior, followed by Oregon and Texas. And one of the weaknesses in trying to follow these numbers of positive cases is that we don't know the ratio of testing. And so we don't have the context. And I saw Rachel Maddow last night, and she put up all these charts of red states, including North Carolina, related to the argument over whether to hold the Republican convention there. And it shows that the cases are on the upsurge where in states like California, we're generally flat. New York is declining. And so the early epicenters, it's generally trailing off. But we don't have the context of the number of tests in each state per capita or per 100,000 to really properly evaluate that. At least that's how I feel. The CDC released another new guidance applying to cruise ships called Interim Guidance for Mitigation of COVID-19 Among Cruise Ship Crew. The guidance establishes a color-coded system based on coronavirus exposure for deciding what measures should be taken. And I've tried to follow this since the Grand Princess brought COVID-19 to San Francisco on the infected ship. And we only get snippets of the plight of these crew members, many of whom are still trapped on their luxury liners with nowhere to go. And speaking of that, 60 former passengers on the Grand Princess filed suit in L.A. federal court against Carnival Cruise Line, alleging the cruise line didn't sanitize the ship between voyages, didn't screen new or existing passengers when they embarked. I think they have a case. The former FDA chief is saying that the epidemic is expanding, that the U.S. still has not put the necessary infrastructure in place to prevent a major second wave. This is from former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb. COVID-19 hospitalizations are on the rise in a number of states, and we're told, again, this is based on Rachel Maddow's reporting, that Alabama, in many cities, is completely maxed out due to a wave of hospital admissions. Gottlieb said Tennessee, Arizona, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Ohio have all seen an increase in hospitalizations. Also, David Dayen at the American Prospect is reporting that while the front door of the Federal Reserve and small business loan bailout programs have been somewhat unavailable to private equity firms, the back door, operated by Health and Human Services, has welcomed the industry. So companies like M-Care, a division of Envision, have been getting interest-free loans from the HHS. Overall, about $1.5 billion in loans have gone to portfolio companies of big equity firms like Cerberus Capital and Apollo Global Management. And where is it in my stack? I have too much going on here. The Trump administration has appointed a White House lawyer that nobody's ever heard of to be the inspector general for all of the money that is being pumped out of the Federal Reserve since the CARES Act passed. That's just another fox in charge of a chicken coop. And the Senate did, by voice vote, unanimously pass the fix to the Paycheck Protection Act that had passed in the House last week. And I'm very glad to hear that for Najeen, our listener in Berkeley, who got one of the loans but was unable to use it because the terms were just so restrictive and didn't fit the situation of her physical therapy business across the bay from me in Berkeley. Also, ProPublica is alerting us that tear gas, even without the presence of the coronavirus, is a very serious irritant, and that it is a form of chemical weapon. Tear gas is not safe, they say. According to a number of experts interviewed by ProPublica, it's been found to cause long-term health consequences, can hurt those who aren't the intended targets, including people inside their homes. And now, the widespread, sometimes indiscriminate use of tear gas on American civilians in the midst of a respiratory pandemic threatens to worsen the coronavirus, along with racial disparities in its spread and who dies from it. This is a serious complication of the action on the streets over the past 10 days. So, as Trump is signing an executive order with another phony claim of an economic emergency, they are looking for ways to waive long-standing environmental laws to speed up federal approval for new mines, highways, pipelines, and other projects. This allows them to waive the normal requirements of the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. And meanwhile, the once uber-liberal Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals here in San Francisco has dealt a big setback to Trump's EPA, telling the Environmental Protection Agency that it broke the law in approving agricultural weed-killing products sold by Bayer and two other chemical giants. These are herbicides that are based on dicamba, and the court just rebuked the agency, said it had no choice but to cancel the EPA's approval of the herbicides because the agency had strayed so far from its duty to properly assess the dangers presented by the new use of dicamba. The court said the EPA made multiple errors in granting the conditional registrations. Also, I want to congratulate Kevin Zeiss, Margaret Flowers, and their two colleagues, including American University professor Adrienne Pine. The four individuals occupied the Embassy of Venezuela in Washington, D.C., at the request of the legitimate government led by Nicolas Maduro. And on June 3rd, so that's yesterday, they were hauled back into court. The government's case against them had collapsed, and they had to submit to a stinging lecture by the district judge, Beryl Howell, I believe an Obama appointee. Judge Howell delivered an unhinged law and order tirade, personally denigrating each of them and declaring her intention to make an example of them. But because the government had offered to drop the charges to avoid a retrial after a hung jury, all four defendants pled guilty to a low-level Class B misdemeanor charge of incommoding. Is that when you're stuck in the bathroom? I don't even know. And they each paid a $750 fine. Today, June 4th, is the anniversary of the effort by people in China to assert some independence and demand some form of participation. And the events at Tiananmen Square are the subject of some controversy now, in particular that the picture of the guy standing up to a tank rolling at him was somehow faked or fabricated. And that may or may not be true. I've not personally investigated it. But it's clear that there was an uprising and that it was brutally suppressed by the Chinese Communist Party and its military. And against that backdrop, today, the not independent legislature in Hong Kong approved measures to punish people who insult the national anthem of China. And this is part of an effort to roll back what limited freedoms are available in Hong Kong. And ordinarily, I'd get full-throated and denounce the Hong Kong government and Beijing as well. But at a time when we have our own tanks in the streets, whether they're Bearcats that are controlled by local police departments or the federal troops that may or may not be today on the streets of Washington, D.C., we have no standing to lecture China. Because while we have enjoyed greater freedoms and some actual liberty in this country in the past, it's clearly declining. And the effort by people to rise up and demand a stop to a descent into a kind of dictatorship or totalitarian for oligarchs form of government, it's on the line right now. And so we have no moral superiority to China and to the knuckling under of the people and what passes for leadership in Hong Kong. And yesterday, the pro-democracy faction in the Hong Kong legislature set off a stink bomb in the chamber, saying that the stench of the actions being taken will last for 10,000 years. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it everywhere. You'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.